Hello, everyone. I'm Ralph, a software engineer here at Genesys, and I would like to share in this DevDrop how to use an Amazon API gateway to invoke Genesys Cloud APIs. And this is part 2, Prerequisites and Setup. So before we can go through the process on how to do it, please ensure you have everything that you'll need to invoke the Genesys Cloud API using the Amazon API gateway. And at the minimum, you'll just need three things. The first one is an AWS account with Amazon API Gateway permissions. The second one is a Genesys account with the necessary permissions for your use case. And the last one is just a basic understanding of both Amazon API Gateway and Genesys Cloud API. So as discussed on the last part with the features of the Amazon API Gateway, we can invoke Genesys Cloud APIs using two types of API gateway. The first one is the HTTP API, and the second is the REST API. There are a lot of differences between the two. So I'm just going to show you an AWS article of that discuss the differences between these two. So you can just search this in the AWS website on their developer guide with the title Choose Between REST APIs and HTTP APIs. So the differences between these two is just simple. HTTP APIs is more of a basic model, while the REST APIs, it's much more of an advanced model, which has more features, and the HTTP is just much more simpler. And with that, HTTP API is cheaper compared to the REST API. And with this article, we can just explore on the differences between these. There are some features that overlap between them, but in essence, the REST API has much more features and much more flexibility compared to the HTTP API. So in here, it discusses more on like some features. So the first one is the endpoint type. So it refers to the endpoint that the API gateway creates. So for REST API, it supports all endpoint types. So it can be edge optimized, can be regional, can be private. So private mean it can only be invoked in the VPC or the virtual private cloud. So for the HTTP API, it can only be using regional endpoint type. So for security, um, for the three security features that AWS provided, REST API supports all of these, while the HTTP API only supports mutual TLS authentication. The REST API supports the certificates for backend authentication and AWS WAF. For authorization, AWS has provided 5 options, which is the IAM, the resource policies, Amazon Cognito, custom authorization with an AWS Lambda function, and the JSON Web Token. For the REST API, the only thing that it doesn't support is the JSON Web Token. However, there is a footnote here that you can use a Lambda authorizer to validate JSON Web Tokens for REST APIs. For HTTP APIs, it supports all of those except for resource policies. So that's it for authorization. The next one is API management. So for HTTP API, it can only support custom domains, while the REST API, it also supports the use of API keys, the per client rate limiting, and the per client usage throttling. So on to the next one, which is the development. So it discusses on the characteristics of your API. So it involves features like coarse configuration, test invocations, caching, user-controlled deployments, automatic deployments, custom gateway responses, canary release deployments, request validation, request parameter transformation, and request body transformation. So as you can see here, the HTTP API only supports course configuration, user control deployments, automatic deployments, and request parameter transformation, while the REST API supports everything except automatic deployments. And the next one is monitoring. So if you want to monitor like logs or like the number of usage of your API, the REST API supports all of the features that the AWS provides, which includes Amazon CloudWatch metrics, access logs, CloudWatch logs, access logs to Amazon Data Firehouse, execution logs, and AWS X-ray tracing. Meanwhile, for the HTTP API, it only supports CloudWatch metrics and access logs to CloudWatch logs. And the last one, which is integrations. So for the REST API, it supports everything from public HTTP endpoints, AWS services, AWS Lambda functions, private integrations with network load balancers, and mock integrations. For the HTTP API, in addition to the public HTTP endpoints, AWS services, AWS Lambda functions, and private integrations with network load balancers, it also supports private integrations with application load balancers and AWS Cloud Map, but it doesn't support mock integrations. So that's it. Those are the differences. And with these points that have been made by the developer guide of AWS, you can decide on which one to use, the HTTP API or the REST API. So once you've decided on which to choose and everything that you need is ready, we can now discuss on how to configure the API gateway in the next video. We'll be starting with the HTTP API. And if you want to go immediately to the REST API, you may do so. But I highly recommend to also watch how we configure the HTTP API. So see you guys in the next one.